I've been wondering about the story of Jesus being attacked on a cliff for as long as I can remember. How did Jesus get out? Perhaps it's because of Sunday school materials from my childhood. I have an image in my head of people fighting and kicking up clouds of dust out of which Jesus simply walks unscathed. This may actually be the implication of the story. It, after all, ends by saying, "But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way." The long-standing question of how did he get out of such a dangerous situation has often distracted me from a far simpler reality. This is a disturbing story. Jesus is at home, a place we might think he would be particularly safe. Jesus is speaking in a center of religious worship, a place we might hope would be particularly nonviolent. Jesus is claiming the care of God for the people of God to people who definitely knew God and needed care, a gift that we might hope would be well received. Instead, they were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built so that they might hurl him off the cliff. Now, I can analyze what made them so mad. Here it is in brief. Jesus claimed more honor than was his fair share in a system where honor was a zero-sum game. Moving on. In terms of the story being a disturbing one, it just doesn't matter all that much why. This attack on Jesus, a potentially deadly attack, is awful. Scholars think Luke is using this story to foreshadow how Jesus' message will be received. That while some will listen and be moved, others will respond with violence to maintain the status quo. And actually that does help because it brings into focus that the end of Jesus' life is really disturbing too. I've never managed to come to peace with capital punishment. And I find that each instance of state-sponsored killing is, well, a lot more than just disturbing. But we can stick with disturbing for the moment. Well, I had an opportunity as a child to hear some truly fantastic preachers regularly and had thoughtful Sunday school teachers and intentional youth group leaders. The U.S. culture's basic atonement theory still permeated my consciousness. I grew up thinking that I was supposed to believe that Jesus died for my sins. And since that was something I was supposed to be grateful for, it meant that Jesus' death was useful or good. You might think I'd avoid good, but note Good Friday. As I've grown, I've been blessed with spaciousness to consider what I really believe and to question things that don't make sense to me. And while I seek to extend that spaciousness to others and respect differences in faith, for me, that has meant leaving behind Jesus died for my sins and leaving in its place Jesus died because his movement threatened the power of the powerful. And whenever I am complicit in protecting existent power structures, I am engaging in the same behavior that got him killed, which I have to admit has a lot less ring to it. I've come back around to finding it disturbing that Jesus, a powerful prophet, a man of incredible morality, an amazing teacher, a notable healer, a wise mystic, and a liberator of the oppressed, was killed because of exactly those things. In fact, I'm back to finding it disturbing when people are killed. And I simply don't exclude when the killing happens via state-sponsored violence. So in this early narrative in Luke, there is a disturbing story that foreshadows a later disturbing story, these stories end up bookmarking most of Jesus' ministry in Luke. All that Jesus offers in teaching, healing, and empowering has over it the shadow of how threatening people find it to have these systems disturbed. Luke, of course, uses Isaiah's vision of someone acting on God's behalf to bring good news to the oppressed, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim the liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, comfort those who mourn, and repair the ruined cities, etc. And Luke notes right from the get-go that this vision of God and Jesus being one called upon to enact it is dangerous work. In the end, Jesus' untimely death was initiated by the powerful religious authorities who thought that his movement threatened the well-being of the entire Jewish population. Feels a little bit like a parallel to this story, where it seems that the hometown faithful were terrified by the implications of what Jesus was going to do. Both groups seem like they would have said, "Don't rock the boat." And "don't rock the boat" is very good advice for getting ahead in life, for moving up ladders of institutional power, for being generally well-liked, and in lots of cases for survival itself. However, it turns out that "don't rock the boat" is not a way of following Jesus. Instead, Jesus followed the path of nonviolence, and that's a difficult path, and one that is abundant in grace and hope. If we think about that work named in Isaiah 61, it becomes clear that the claim is that his was profoundly nonviolent work. Not only is the work itself not violent, which is a good start, but it's aimed at disentangling the power of violence that disrupts life itself. It can be far too easy to only take notice at direct, visible, physical violence and miss all the other kinds. Of course, those of us who have been trained in safe sanctuaries were reminded that abuse itself can look like physical abuse, or like sexual abuse, or like emotional abuse, or like neglect. Furthermore, violence can also look like just the threat of violence that's used to keep people in check, even if it isn't regularly used. And on top of those pieces, violence can be a wolf in sheep's clothing. I would say that violence includes allowing people to be hungry when there is an abundance of food, because some people don't earn enough to eat. That's a violence that looks like societal neglect. Violence looks like people not being able to get health care, or get access to needed medication, or get life-saving treatment because of who they are or what they have. That's a deadly form of violence, but it's out of lack and not a direct attack. So sometimes it isn't seen as such. Violence looks like campaigns to doctors to prescribe opiates, knowing full well that they would lead to addiction, knowing that they would lead to death, and choosing profit over lives. And violence looks like the laws that we have to prevent people with convictions from being able to have places to live, or food to eat, or jobs to provide for their needs, even though the convictions themselves have more to do with our justice system than they do with individual actions. It seems like it's time to make this a little bit more concise. All forms of iniquity and hierarchy are less visible forms of violence. So violence is a lot, which actually means that nonviolence is also a lot. And for those of you tuning in for the first time, Jesus led a movement of nonviolence, and to choose to be a Jesus follower is to choose the way of nonviolence. There was a fun note in the social science commentary on the Synoptic Gospels that said, "An over-quick resort to violence is often an unintended public admission of failure. In honor challenge," which they think is what was happening with Jesus and the people in the synagogue, "in honor challenge, the party that first resorts to violence loses the exchange. A resort to violence indicates that wits have failed and bully tactics have taken over." So part of what we're seeing in this gospel lesson is that violence tries to take Jesus down, which itself proves Jesus right, and Jesus does not resort to violence, but somehow walks away from it. And then he spends his ministry as a non-violent religious leader who attempts to change the systems of oppression that are less visible forms of violence, and invites us to follow him. One of the most visible nonviolent religious followers of Jesus in recent times was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And even today, the King Center continues to teach the principles and practices of nonviolence. I regularly reread them and seek further education about nonviolence as a way of following Jesus and respecting the movement that Dr. King himself was a part of. The King Center states, "The triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism are forms of violence that exist in a vicious cycle." And they, of course, expand on what that means and then name the principles of nonviolence and steps in nonviolent change. For example, principle 1 of nonviolence. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is not a method for cowards. It does resist. It is active, nonviolent resistance to evil. It is aggressive spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. There are 5 more, and I highly recommend the teachings of the King Center as a further reading for good living. In this moment, however, I have a very pragmatic suggestion about nonviolence because I have seen that there are high levels of angst and anxiety pretty much everywhere right now, and I'm told that others have noticed too. It's often being seen through emotional outbursts at strangers, particularly ones in some sort of customer service work, or at loved ones, because that's where we most often let off steam. I believe that one of the most powerful tools of nonviolence is compassion. And I believe that compassion is needed in 2 directions. One is aimed towards others, particularly those who are struggling, with the hope that we might respond with calm, caring empathy when others need it. The other is towards ourselves, which is both how we gain that capacity to respond with calm towards others and how we work towards having fewer outbursts of our own. This week, a fellow clergy person asked for help in dealing with her pent-up anger and asked clergy sisters how they do it. And the responses were super helpful. Exercise, therapy, throwing things that are safe to throw at not someone or something alive, medicine, screaming, and also self-compassion. She asked, I answered. To deal with anger for me means that I need to know what is under it, what value I hold or what need I have that is being violated, so that I can figure out how I want to respond, not react. Although, even more pragmatic, sometimes before I can examine my anger, I have to do the work of admitting that I am angry. And to do that, I take the advice of Thich Nhat Hanh and breathe in, I'm angry, and breathe out, I'm angry, until I get the sense that the anger has been acknowledged. Then I can deal with it. We can't build God's kingdom unless we are doing it non-violently. Violence isn't going to get us to nonviolent justice. And it's hard work to be nonviolent. It takes intention and practice and community, as well as heaps of grace. It means we're constantly working on it in ourselves and in each other. And it means that every moment is an opportunity to try again. The world responded with violence to God's vision of nonviolence and to Jesus's teachings of justice. But Jesus responded with the power of nonviolence anyway, and it turns out that that was enough that we are still here following his ways 2,000 years later. Nonviolence isn't the fastest way, but it is the only way. So may God help us along our way. Amen.